All right, let's get right into it. Today, in this explainer, we are unpacking a really fascinating, truly transformative era in history. We're going to explore exactly how ordinary people in the Indian subcontinent sought out a direct, personal connection to the divine between the 8th and 18th centuries. We're talking about the rise of the Bhakti and Sufi movements. Now, these were parallel paths of devotion, and what's so cool is that even though they originated from entirely different theological backgrounds, they shared this remarkably similar spirit. They were all about accessibility, deep emotional connection, and frankly, some pretty bold social critique.
And that brings us to the crucial question we're answering today. Imagine living in a society where just connecting with God required complex rituals, knowing exclusive languages like Sanskrit or Arabic, and going through a really strict elite priestly class. It's a lot, right? So how would you, just as an everyday person, a peasant, an artisan, express your faith? Well, over 1,000 years ago, millions of people figured out how to completely bypass those barriers, and the methods they used literally reshaped the entire cultural fabric of the region.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with a mosaic of beliefs, move into early Bhakti traditions, then Sufism in the subcontinent, look at the power of local languages, and wrap up with dialogue, dissent, and legacy.
Kicking things off with Section 1, a mosaic of beliefs.
To really understand why the Bhakti and Sufi paths were so revolutionary, and they were kind of the punk rock movements of 8th century religion, honestly, we first have to understand the environment they grew out of. It was a world totally dotted with stupas, monasteries, and temples with incredibly diverse beliefs constantly bumping into each other. Sociologist Robert Redfield actually coined these terms the great and little traditions to describe this. Basically, the great tradition is the official stuff, the rituals pushed by rulers and priests. The little tradition is the local, everyday customs of the common folks. And what historians have found is that these two didn't just exist in separate bubbles. They were constantly talking to and changing each other. Brahminical ideas were simplified into everyday Sanskrit to reach more people, and at the exact same time, Orthodox priests were taking local grassroots beliefs and reworking them into the official canon. To put that into perspective and see how this integration worked, take a look here. On the right, you have Jagannatha from Puri in Orissa. Now, historically, this image was made of wood by local tribal specialists, but by the 12th century, this local tribal deity was completely integrated into the official Puranic framework and recognized as an incarnation of the major Hindu god Vishnu. We see this exact same thing happen with local goddess cults, where simple stones smeared with ochre were eventually equated with principal deities like Parvati or Lakshmi. It's a total merging of worlds.
Moving on to Section 2, early Bhakti traditions.
So building on that long history of temple worship, early poet-saints started creating these highly inclusive communities. They brought this deeply emotional, sometimes trance-like adoration of the divine that welcomed people who were historically shut out, including women and lower castes. Historians basically categorize these early Bhakti movements into two main paths. On one side, you've got Saguna, which means with attributes. This is all about worshiping specific, recognizable deities. Think Shiva, Vishnu, or the goddess, usually in human-like forms. On the flip side is Nirguna, or without attributes, and this was focused on worshiping a totally abstract, formless concept of God.
And this 12th century bronze sculpture of Manikavachaka, who was a devoted follower of Shiva, is a brilliant illustration of that Saguna tradition. As early as the 6th century, groups like the Alvars, who were entirely devoted to Vishnu, and the Nayanars, devotees of Shiva, would just travel from place to place. They'd sing these incredibly passionate hymns and declare specific shrines as the homes of their chosen deities. Over time, those spots evolved into massive pilgrimage centers, and their poetry literally became part of the daily temple rituals.
But the Bhakti movement wasn't a monolith. Down in Karnataka, you have the Virashaivas or Lingayats, who showed just how diverse this could be. Emerging in the 12th century under a Brahmana named Basavana, they took a completely different route. They worshipped Shiva exclusively as a linga, and they fundamentally rejected certain orthodox rules, which for the time was absolutely radical. For example, they believe that when a devotee dies, they unite directly with Shiva and don't return to this world. So they completely bypassed the traditional practice of cremation and chose instead to ceremonially bury their dead.
Let's shift gears now to Section 3, Sufism in the subcontinent.
Right parallel to the Bhakti Saints, Islamic mystics known as Sufis were out there seeking their own intensely personal connection to God. Instead of getting bogged down in rigid early theological dogmas, they emphasized salvation through this intense, burning love for the divine. And by the 11th century, this movement became incredibly organized. The center of it all was the khanqah, or hospice, basically the bustling hub of their social and spiritual life. It was run by a teaching master, known as a sheikh, pir, or murshid. This master would take on disciples called murids, and eventually name a khalifa or successor. And tying the whole thing together was the silsila, which literally translates to chain. It represented this unbroken spiritual genealogy going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad.
But hey, life in the hospice definitely wasn't just strict rules and hierarchy. When the Chishti Sufis migrated to the subcontinent in the late 12th century, they adapted to the local culture so beautifully. They had this deeply emotional practice called sama, or mystical audition. Specially trained musicians, called qawwals, would perform these mystical chants designed to completely envelop the listener and evoke a state of divine ecstasy. It was a really immersive, powerful interaction with the devotional traditions that were already there. Which brings us to Section 4, the power of local languages.
Think about it. If your whole goal is to bypass the elite middlemen, you can't be speaking their exclusive languages. You have to speak the language of the streets, the fields, the homes. Both the Bhakti and Sufi movements figured this out, and local dialects became their ultimate secret weapon. Just look at this breakdown. They completely dropped orthodox Sanskrit and Arabic. The Alvars and Nayanars, they sang in Tamil. The Khojas spread their ideas using Punjabi, Multani, Sindhi, and Gujarati. The Chishti Sufis up in Delhi just spoke in Hindavi, the everyday language of the locals. And down in Bijapur, Sufis were composing poems in Deccani. By using regional languages, they made sure their message was instantly understood by the masses.
And they didn't just translate the words, they adapted to the rhythms of everyday peasant life. They literally embedded heavy spiritual lessons into wedding songs and romantic stories. Some Sufis wrote these epic long poems called masnavis, using human romance as a metaphor for the soul searching for the divine, like the famous love story Padmavat. Down in the Deccan, Sufi poems were written specifically to be sung by women while they were doing chores, like spinning thread or grinding grain, or even used as lullabies. It was through this super intimate domestic medium that complex theology actually took root in the everyday villages of the subcontinent. And that leads us perfectly into our final section, number 5, dialogue, dissent, and legacy. As you might guess, when these movements got big, they definitely caused some friction with the establishment. Because they weren't just offering a new way to pray, they were actively calling out the orthodox institutions. Listen to this from the 14th century poet Kabir. Neither can find the only Ram. One kills the goat, the other cows. They waste their lives in disputation. I mean, he wasn't pulling any punches. Kabir is an incredible example of a poet saint who absolutely refused to be boxed in. He looked at religious conflict and ritualistic animal sacrifice and basically called out the futility of it all, critiquing both Hindu and Islamic orthodoxies right down the middle. What is just so fascinating is how Kabir essentially built his own path. Having no allegiance to the orthodox extremes of his day, he wove together Islamic and Hindu theological tools to forge a totally unique nirguna path. It was a revolutionary synthesis. He'd pull from Islamic ideas of monotheism to critique idol worship, but then he'd turn around and use the Sufi concepts of zikr, remembrance, and ishq, divine love, to express the traditional Hindu practice of nam samaran, the meditative remembrance of God's name. He created this incredibly fluid, dynamic theology that bypassed priests entirely and spoke directly to a formless divine. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this to ponder. Why do these centuries-old paths of unity and accessibility still resonate so loudly today? When we examine the Bhakti and Sufi movements, we aren't just blowing the dust off ancient history. We are looking at a timeless, universal human desire for an unmediated, deeply emotional connection with the world and the divine. They proved that spirituality isn't necessarily locked behind an ancient language or a complex ritual. It can be right there in the songs we sing and the daily work we do. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.